Okay, let's just jump right in today with a bit of a weird puzzle for you. What could Coca-Cola, the Harvard University fight song, and an army of potato bugs possibly have in common? I mean, it sounds like the setup to a bizarre joke, right? But the punchline is actually deeply rooted in history. Keep that question in the back of your mind because the answer unlocks some of the most surprising, heavily guarded, and downright weird secrets of a time we thought we fully understood. Welcome to today's Explainer. We are going to explore the absurd, bizarre, and entirely unexpected facts of World War II. We usually learn about the largest conflict in human history through broad strokes, right? The major battles, the towering historical figures, those sweeping geopolitical shifts. But today, we're zooming way in. We're going to examine the strange trivia, the unbelievable ironies, and the forgotten oddities that were generated in the absolute chaos of a global conflict. So, here is our battle plan for today. We'll start with before the guns fired, look at some bizarre weapons and tactics, shift over to life on the home front, examine unlikely heroes in defiance, and finally, we'll explore the war's weird legacy. All right, part one, before the guns fired, ironies and blunders. So the term Nazi has obviously become this universal shorthand for absolute evil. But the party didn't actually want to be called that. Originally, they preferred the nickname Nassos, which was short for the National Socialist Party. The term Nazi was actually coined by a journalist named Konrad Haydn, and he deliberately derived it from a Bavarian word meaning stupid or simple-minded. Somehow the party completely missed the insults, and, well, the name stuck globally. It's wild when you look at the stark contrast here. For centuries, this ancient Sanskrit symbol, meaning a hooked cross, was used by ancient civilizations from Greece all the way to India to represent fertility, peace, and good fortune. The regime just entirely twisted this ancient religious symbol, permanently attaching it to their war machine and their acts of atrocity. And the sheer absurdity of their ideology really didn't stop there. In 1935, the regime launched this massive propaganda campaign to find the perfect Aryan baby. The propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, selected the striking photo of a brunette child for posters all across the country. But here is the incredible twist. That photo was submitted by Hans Bahlen, a prominent anti-Nazi photographer. And the child? She was Jewish. Bahlen submitted the photo specifically to sabotage the campaign and basically expose the complete ridiculousness of their race science. It worked flawlessly, though her family ultimately did have to flee to Latvia for safety. Moving right along to Section 2. Bizarre weapons and tactics, ingenuity and absurdity. Consider these wild, completely failed plots. First up, we've actually solved part of our opening riddle. They legitimately drafted a plan to weaponize the Colorado potato beetle. The goal was to drop millions of these pests on British farmlands to just devastate their food supply and starve the island. The only reason it was scrapped, it just wasn't feasible to somehow collect the 40 million bugs they needed. Seriously, 40 million bugs. Then there was this rumor of a radio wave death ray. A British engineer named Robert Watson Watt investigated this, proved it was impossible, but actually used his research to develop modern radar, which gave the British a massive defensive advantage. Oh, and let's not forget the plan to occupy Vatican City and assassinate Pope Pius XII, partly because the dictator was furious that Catholic schools displayed pictures of Jesus instead of his own portrait. Economic warfare was also very much on the table, which brings us to this massive number, $132 million. Back in 1939, the German leadership hatched a scheme to completely crash the British economy through hyperinflation. How? Well, by enlisting concentration camp prisoners to painstakingly forge over $132 million worth of British pounds. If that had been fully injected into the British economy, it would equate to over $6 billion today. Now, while those bizarre plots were flopping, the Allies were secretly building the atomic bomb. Notice the vast difference between the first two nuclear bombs ever detonated in combat. You had Little Boy, which was powered by the fission of uranium-235, but Fat Man, dropped just days later, used an entirely different mechanism powered by plutonium, which made it a staggering 40% more powerful than the first one. Of course, before those weapons were ever used in combat, they had to be tested on U.S. soil, out in the New Mexico desert. The terrifying success of that test prompted one of the project's lead scientists, J. Robert Oppenheimer, to quote this truly haunting line from a Hindu sacred text. It just perfectly captured the horrifying reality of what human ingenuity had just unleashed upon the entire world. All right, shifting gears to Section 3, life on the home front, pop culture and paranoia. Wartime paranoia led to some pretty abrupt cultural shifts back home. Because of its Germanic roots, the beloved American hamburger was suddenly, and honestly somewhat pointlessly, renamed the Liberty Steak in a lot of locations. Meanwhile, the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, which was made up of many Native American soldiers from the Southwest, had to very quickly change their uniform pins. For years, they had proudly worn a swastika, which is a traditional Native American symbol of good luck. But by 1939, they smartly swapped it out for a Thunderbird. Even the Axis side had to rebrand a bit. The German dictator traveled in a highly fortified, super luxurious personal train that was originally named America. For obvious reasons, once the US entered the war, that became pretty awkward, and it was quickly renamed to Brandenburg.
And boom, here is the second piece to our opening riddle. What on earth does Coca-Cola have to do with this? Well, during the war, U.S. manufacturing was strictly focused on essentials: ammo, armor, medical supplies, and soda? Coca-Cola was deemed so absolutely vital to troop morale that the company set up manufacturing plants in North Africa. This let them ship millions of bottles directly to soldiers across the Mediterranean, which was an audacious logistical feat that ultimately cemented Coke as this massive global household name.
Meanwhile, over in Europe, censorship was backfiring in just the most spectacular way. Obsessed with cultural purity, the regime cracked down on anything they deemed degenerate. They gathered 650 banned books, paintings, and sculptures and shoved them into this massive exhibition that was specifically designed to mock the creators. But the plan totally failed. The public flocked to the exhibit in droves. It ended up drawing far larger crowds than the officially approved state-sponsored art galleries. Hitler basically accidentally created a blockbuster art show for the exact people he was trying to erase.
Okay, part 4. Unlikely heroes and defiance. Courage in the darkness.
Talk about your ultimate wait, what moment. William Patrick Stewart Houston was just a normal lad growing up in Liverpool, England, who eventually immigrated to the US and joined the Navy. His big secret? His father was Alois Hitler Jr., making him the half-nephew of the very dictator the Allies were fighting. Not only did he take up arms against his mad uncle's empire, but he was actually wounded in combat and awarded a Purple Heart for his service.
Defiance took incredible, literal life-or-death bravery on the front lines. When American troops were captured, guards would frequently demand that Jewish soldiers be singled out and separated from the rest. But when Master Sergeant Roderick Edmonds, an American POW, was ordered to identify the Jewish soldiers in his unit, he boldly stared down his captors and delivered this exact quote. By refusing to comply and putting his entire unit at risk of execution, he actually scared off the guards with the threat of war crimes prosecution. That single act of defiance saved an estimated 300 lives. Sometimes, though, defiance was this massive, collective, national effort. Unlike a lot of occupied nations, Denmark had surrendered quickly, which paradoxically gave them slightly more autonomy under occupation. When the crackdown eventually came, the Danish people utilized that buffer time to organize a massive secret evacuation. They successfully smuggled the vast majority of their Jewish population across the water to neutral Sweden, saving them from the death camps.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the war's weird legacy, echoes of the conflict. First, we kind of just need to visually ground ourselves in the sheer scale of the devastation. 21 million. This staggering figure represents the estimated Russian casualties by the end of the conflict. The Eastern Front was a meat grinder of unprecedented proportions, accounting for roughly 80% of all German casualties as well. The scale of loss on that single front is honestly almost impossible to comprehend. Yet, out of that absolute nightmare of bloodshed came some truly remarkable medical advancements. While it was the deadliest conflict in history, it also saw the highest rate of seriously injured soldiers surviving and returning home. Crucially, for the very first time in combat history, blood transfusions were used consistently and widely right on the battlefield, establishing medical protocols that literally still save countless lives today. But politically, did the war actually end for everyone in 1945? Well, no. We think of the war ending when the Axis powers collapsed, but the Soviet Union was actively invading Japanese territories in the final days. Fast forward to the year 2000, and peace negotiations between modern Russia and Japan completely failed over a dispute regarding seized islands. Meaning today, technically speaking, a formal peace treaty has never been signed between the two nations. On paper, that front remains totally unresolved. Which brings us to our final takeaway, and the very last piece of our opening riddle. We talked about Coca-Cola, and we talked about potato bugs, but what about the Harvard University fight song?
Well, if you ever hear the infamous fascist Sieg Heil March song, you might get a weird sense of déjà vu. It sounds almost exactly like the Harvard fight song, because the composer actually attended Harvard and committed a bit of blatant musical plagiarism. It just perfectly encapsulates our journey today. If the most heavily researched, meticulously documented conflict in human history still hides bizarre secrets like plagiarized fight songs and weaponized Beatles, you really have to ask yourself, what else has history forgotten? Just waiting to be uncovered. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.